In this video, we're going to talk through the CNY HMIS client consent form or release of information. Adding in a release in HMIS is different than the actual form. We're going to go through the ins and outs of what the form says and really what it does in regards to data and data sharing and privacy. So there's two different types of client consent forms or ROIs. There is the actual consent form that the client sits down with you in front of you and you explain it to the client and they sign it. And then there's the verbal consent form, which we'll also walk through. The important thing to know about the client consent is it does not say anything about entering data into HMIS. So entering data into HMIS is not voluntary. So each provider, when they sign an agency agreement, agrees to enter the required data elements associated with either their funder or their project type. The client consent form is really all about opening up the visibility within HMIS. So giving the client control over who sees their information and if other agencies have the ability to see their information within the system. There are some projects that are exempt from participating in the ROI and consent form process. Victim service providers or providers that serve domestic violence victims primarily have to enter all of their data in a comparable database. So the HMIS client consent form does not pertain to those projects. Also, projects that serve individuals with HIV and AIDS like HAPWA and other projects with that demographic and that dedicated subpopulation are not allowed to participate in the client consent process and sharing visibility openly. So when you first come into HMIS, it's really important that you read through the client consent forms, you know all of the information that's located and are able to explain this client consent process or the release of information process to the clients you're serving. There are three forms. One is the basic client consent form in English. We do have one available in Spanish, and there's also the verbal client consent form, which you can obtain via conversation if you're doing a phone call or if you're doing a Zoom or video chat and the client isn't present in front of you to sign off on the authorization. You can get verbal authorization from the individual or family. So we're going to go through the client consent in detail so we can help explain the process to you so that you can better explain it to the clients you're serving. So this written consent is offered to clients with the option that they can control whether or not other agencies located within HMIS can see and update information that's already located within the database. The important information and that can be seen and is helpful to be seen is proof of homelessness. So if you're trying to prove homelessness or verify it for eligibility requirements, income, insurance, services, housing, and food. The agency itself can only release client records to non-partner agencies that do not operate within HMIS with a proper written consent form. That's an agency's form to release information outside of the system. And any research performed with this data is completely de-identified. There's no personally identifying information that's revealed within research or public operating data sets from HMIS. It's only aggregate data, which is numbers. Decisions to deny services can not be part of the release of information process cannot be part of that. So if a person or a family declines to sign the release of information, you cannot refuse services. So that signature does not mean that they don't qualify and cannot be served. So that's a federal regulation. So make sure that the client understands that if they say that they do not want their information shared across HMIS, that doesn't mean that they're not going to be eligible for services. A client can withdraw their release of information at any time, and there's a section within the release, and we'll talk about that in a minute, If they can refuse to sign it after 1 year, so all releases of information are good for only 1 year and can't be longer than a year. So a client can rescind the release within that year period of time, or they can just let the release lapse. If a client wants to continue to sign and update the release, you have to offer that to them every year in order for their data to be visible across the system. So there is a box in each release of information, and it's based upon your continuum of care. So each continuum of care will have their own release of information, including all agencies and providers that are located within their HMIS implementation. So this one is for New York 505. There's a separate one for New York 510. So all agencies will be identified within this box. So when a client is signing this consent form, it's allowing information to be viewable by these organizations. It doesn't mean that these all agencies and all users within these agencies will view information. We do have audits that are done on every user quarterly, so we can see if HMIS users are going into client files that they have no reason to go into. So that's called a violation of PII. So if a user goes into a client file that they have no reason to do so based upon their current role that they have in the system, that's considered a violation, and there's a process for that type of violation. In New York 505, any agencies within this box that are bolded operate and participate within the coordinated entry system. So this is a separate part of the release of information. So clients can opt out of the full HMIS release of information and only participate in coordinated entry. So it's part of the operation of the release. So they can authorize the HHC to share homeless history as it's recorded in HMIS with either particular agency or other coordinated entry agencies. And they can also authorize the HHC to record, share information pertaining to eligibility of housing programs. And then this information is only shared with coordinated entry agencies. And the minimum necessary information is collected and shared. So there's two options within the coordinated entry release. So make sure your agency's name is located in that spot where it says agency name before the client signs this document. There are the dates of release. So a client can choose to backdate the visibility and when this release is effective. So an example of that is if your client comes into your shelter and he comes in today, however, the case manager doesn't sit down with the person until next week to sign the authorized forms, a client can decide to backdate this release and allow information to be visible or viewable across the system for their initial date of service, which was would be today, technically. And then again, the end date can only be a year from that initial first date of service. The client signature and date needs to be located on the actual signed consent form. The agency witness, so the person sitting with the client, also needs to sign that as well as date it so that this is effective for this agency standards. The next section of the release has to do with authorization to rescind the release or to kind of end it. So the client, if they wanted the release to end, would just simply check the checkbox that says I rescind my authorization. And I do not want any future information to be shared. So this date that they sign it is that's when the end date of the ROI in HMIS is effective. So if you needed to change that, you could just backdate the end date of the ROI to the date that the client rescinded the release. The last portion of this has to do with families or households. So if you have multiple household members within your project and you're being served, you would put the head of household's name who signed the initial consent form or release of information, and then you would put all other household members' names, their date of birth, and then the head of household would sign again to include other members of the household in the CNY HMIS consent. And then again, a spot for the agency witness and the date. So that's the hard copy initial consent form. We're going to go through the verbal consent form briefly. One thing to note about the verbal consent form is there's an actual script that you have to read out loud. So it says read the following out loud, and I'm not going to go through it myself, but just make sure this script is being read to the client before the client agrees to sign the release of information. The same for the verbal consent. A client can change it for the first date of service and then have it effective for a full year. And then the client has the option to participate in the full CNY HMIS release of information, or just consent to coordinated entry processes and the coordinated entry agencies that are listed in the release form. Yes or no. The agency witness, you sign it and then you print your name and then you date it. And then there's a separate section for the household members that are included in this verbal consent form. And then the last document we're going to review is the HMIS client fact sheet. This is a sheet that must be given to clients upon entry into your project. This should be part of your intake process for your specific project and agency. This is a fact sheet that clients can take with them, read through if they want to, or if they want you to read through it with them. It's a great tool to help explain what HMIS is, what coordinated entry is, what does the release do, and what it doesn't do, and why they should sign the release of information. So give them some reasons why, and then some things to consider when signing or agreeing to the verbal release, such as if they're experiencing domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking, and that's the reason for their homelessness or at risk of homelessness situation. They might want to consider keeping their information private and opting out of the release of information portion of HMIS. Again, letting them know that all agencies listed on the ROI will be able to view the information, but exceptions can be made for specific situations. So like an example would be if they have a family member that they know is working at a different agency and they're seeking shelter and they don't want that family member to be able to view their information, we need to know that ahead of time so that we can put proper blocking of visibility to that specific agency and project. Some other things to know about HMIS and the release of information. We do participate in the New York State Office of Temporary Disability Assistance data warehouse. So this data warehouse holds all of our COC data. However, once the data is pulled out of the system with personal identifying information in it, however, once it's uploaded directly into the database, all personal information is erased and can no longer be tracked back to that individual. So it is exported out of the system by a system administrator at the Housing and Homeless Coalition, but once we upload it into NYSHADE, it's automatically unidentified and it can never be traced back to any individual person. If a client ever has questions or concerns regarding ROI, they can always email us, or if you ever have any questions or concerns regarding the HMIS release of information or privacy process or policies, please email the HMIS@unitedway-cny.org email. There also is a last section has to do with what happens if someone accesses my data. So this explains a client's rights within HMIS, and if they feel an agency or a user at an agency has violated their privacy, the process of what to do. And if you as an agency staff or HMIS user, you can report violations as well directly to the HMIS@unitedway-cny.org email. There is a policy located within the HMIS policies and procedure manuals. Make sure you are also reading through that document as well and really gaining an understanding of what happens within that process. So all clients can have full access to their HMIS record. It is a formalized process. They do have to fill out a form called a client audit request form. They don't, they're not permitted to sit down with a user in front of the database and view their information. It has to happen just like with any other medical records. A release or a request has to be put and submitted, and they do receive a printout version, or we can email their documents if that's their choice to an identified email address. So if you have any questions, again, please send an email to the HMIS email here at United Way. Thank you.